What did your personal routine look like, especially in that first stage of being diagnosed with diabetes and getting out of that?
Yeah, well, the first stage was more fundamentalist than my life is now. And I needed that because I was in a relatively acute situation. Now, like, I'm not nearly as neurotic about my program because I've set a baseline, like a solid
Yeah.
metabolic baseline, and I've built up just non negotiable habits. Um, but in those early days, what I was starting to experiment, and I I really think of like my protocols as being half a distillation of interviewing brilliant people and like half a lot of me search, just N of one experimentation. So I started to experiment with different fasting protocols. So certainly like a basic intermittent 16/8 fasting protocol became pretty central to what I was doing. I changed the nature of my diet itself from a carb heavy diet to more of a keto oriented diet. So a combination of good amount of plant consumption for fiber, but then a really much more protein and low glycemic index. So that was kind of how I started to think about food. And then one of the keys was adopting a cold water therapy protocol. So I got very into some of the Wim Hof stuff and then trying to modify that. And I have a very particular viewpoint on that, which maybe I'll get to. And then the last bit was really doing more resistance training. I was never that gym rat guy. I'm sort of a closeted gym rat now. And because muscle is it's beneficial for so many things, but it is incredibly beneficial for blood glucose management because it is essentially just a glucose vacuum, and you don't even really need insulin to uptake glucose with the contraction of muscle. So you're giving your pancreas a break there too. So it was really the stacking of a of an intermittent fasting protocol, a cold water therapy protocol, and then the right combination of kind of zone two and resistance training that really started to make the difference for me.
And did you have anyone in your corner helping you out, or is this kind of just you on your own doing that me search, like you said, and building this out yourself?
Well, fortunately, like I host a podcast where all I do, or all I did really for 5 years was interview doctors, and they'd all come and stay at my house more or less. We have a retreat center in Topanga where I was doing most of these. And with a cold plunge and a sauna and a yoga studio and hiking trails and all this stuff and a chef and all this stuff that we run as part of our retreat center. So I was pretty lucky to be able to sit there with Mark Hyman and Sarah Gottfried and Casey Means and a lot of folks that were very, very generous with their knowledge and their different viewpoints and diagnoses of where I was. And then it just became applying that to my own bio individual self and finding the right recipes, for me, essentially. But where I saw really just an accelerated um, impact was the stacking of those first couple protocols that I talked about. So because most of my issues were metabolic related to blood sugar management, you know, the intermittent fasting protocol that's going to give my pancreas a much needed break from producing insulin. Then because of that, my cells would become more insulin sensitive because they wouldn't be resistant to the product. Um, we kind of know that through drinking too much beer in high school or college, right? We become basically resistant to the product. We develop a high threshold. The same thing is actually fairly true for any molecule in the body, but it's true for insulin. The more when we have hyperinsulinemia, like a lot of circulating insulin, we become essentially resistant to it. And so by giving my pancreas a break and lowering insulin levels through fasting, I became more insulin sensitive. And then obviously through the adoption of a keto diet where my macronutrient proportions were much more around protein and fat and much less about carbohydrates, I was also lowering blood glucose. So that was helpful. And then I started to cold plunge in a very, very particular way. So prior to breaking fast, I would get in the cold plunge. So maybe like 10 o'clock in the morning. And at that point, I would have very low blood glucose levels because I would be in a fasted state. I had adopted this keto focused diet. And then I would get into the cold plunge. My core body temperature would plummet, right? And then my body would seek out that middle way. It would engage in some thermogenesis. And my mitochondria and my cells would look around because they needed an energy substrate to make heat to get myself back up into that Goldilocks zone. And they'd be looking and they couldn't find a lot of glucose. So what else did they have at their disposal? The other substrate for energy, fat. And so they would go into my fat cells and essentially convert triglycerides to free fatty acids and ketones in order to warm myself back up. And that little cadence for me of intermittent fasting and keto diet and cold therapy in that little Tetris, I just saw unbelievable results in a very short period of time. 4 or 5 months, I lost 60 pounds and really started to my blood sugar level started to really level out. So it was
Wow.
pretty amazing for me. But I also want to say that this is what worked for me, and I can understand the mechanisms behind it, and the mechanisms, I can explain them and they make sense. But everybody is also a little bit different, and particularly women are different in terms of their reaction to fasting and cold. And there's a lot of amazing, smart women that are talking about like how to fast intelligently and how to, particularly, for women who are in their cycle or past their cycle, or women's relationship with cold seems seemingly a little different than men. So, I want to just say that this was my personal experience. I think that there are some aspects of human physiology that apply to everyone, given that we all share 99.1% of our DNA. And I apologize for that. But there's obviously bio individuality, so everyone needs to figure out their own little mix.